Alexander the Great, the young man who conquered the known world at such a young age, and then the story goes that because there was really no more for him to conquer, he just started crying and sobbing because there was just nothing left. What a conqueror. Now, I remember I've talked to people before. My grandfather is one of them. I asked the question, how do you, when you work on, we'll say your legacy, you work on your ministry, your work, how do you set up a situation where people won't come after you and ruin what you started? You know what I mean? So you're trying to do a ministry, you're trying to do something for the kingdom. Say you start a Bible college, or say you start some other ministry. How do you right now make decisions so that in the future a person won't come in and take charge of that ministry after you're long gone and turn it a different direction than you think it should go? And so I was asking him, and I've asked others that kind of question.
Does Ecclesiastes talk about that?
It probably does.
Yeah. One who comes after me won't really care about my stuff.
It does talk about that.
Yeah.
It does. The fleeting nature of life. And so you know what my grandfather told me? Here's what you need to do, Seth. Nothing. His answer was, you can't help that.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hear that answer, though. I still don't like that answer. There's got to be I like to think that there are little things we can do that might help in the long run, but I do think the overarching principle is true. You cannot control what people do after you. One of the best things I see people do on earth is to raise up godly offspring, because that has the biggest effect. If you want to control what happens after you, that's about the only way I can think of for you to make that happen, is practicing discipleship and allowing others to continue with that message. So Alexander the Great was a famous conqueror, and he definitely had the military strategy in mind. And we talked about how he had these collisions or these meetings with the Jews, and he was favorable towards them. Why was he favorable towards these Jewish people? They're so weak.
Book of Daniel.
Oh. What about the book of Daniel? Why does the book of Daniel have anything to do with this?
Foretold what was going to happen over at Tyre.
Yes. The high priest at that time, Jaddua, and a procession of people dressed in white came out to meet Alexander as he made his way south. So he had just taken Tyre, which would be up further north, and he was making his way south towards where Jerusalem is. And that's when they came out to meet him, dressed in white. The priest said, hey, I had a dream. And then Alexander realized, I had that same dream as well. And the priest said, did you know that we expected you? We've been waiting for you to come, because the prophets of God already foretold that your coming was going to happen. And he showed him some scriptures from the book of Daniel. Alexander the Great looked at those scriptures and said, you're right. This is talking about me. And so instead of conquering, he offered a tribute to them, basically saying, you know what? You guys are going to be protected by me. Yes, you're going to pay taxes, tribute like the rest, but every 7 years I'm going to give you tax relief. And that was the time that the Samaritans decided, oh, we're Jews too, because they wanted that tax relief as well. They were trying to jump in with that. So he was very favorable towards the Jews. But even with all of that man's accomplishments, you still can't control what happens after you. So Alexander dies, and his generals take over. So why do we have different colors on this particular map? Well, that's because his empire was divided up among his generals. Among the people that had authority, there were these divisions of the Greeks. Now, some of you might know more about this than I do, so feel free to correct me. I'm not going to be offended by it, because I'm just trying to pull things to mind that I've heard it somewhere along the line, but I don't want to get any of it wrong. My understanding is there were a bunch of divisions. I think there were almost 8 of them. However, most of the divisions that take place after Alexander were not significant. They really didn't amount to much. Let's see, I got a slide on this. Yeah, Alexander's successors. The big ones are going to be the Ptolemies. That's a silent P. Don't know why we have that in the English language, but a silent P, the Ptolemies. And these would be the people that took over the land of Egypt. So even though on the map they're represented in orange, they're not as big as the green, but they are huge in the fact that they control the Nile, and they controlled the Nile Delta, which is that triangular, upside down triangular part of the north base of the Nile, where it comes in. That was the most fertile land you could get in that region. I mean, so they've got a lot in their favor. You know it was good land because the Egyptians before them worshipped that river. That's one of the reasons why God turned it into blood. You worship this thing, I'll show you who's more powerful than this thing, So the Ptolemies are ones that took over Egypt, and every ruler they had was named, ready for this? Ptolemy. Every last one of their, Ptolemy the first, Ptolemy the second, Ptolemy the third. Isn't that wonderful? Was it George Foreman, or who was it that named all his kids George? George and George and George. So how did he differentiate? We don't know. Big George, Little George, Ugly George, Little George. Bye, George. Yeah. So it's easier to remember. They're all tall. So at least you can remember where they came from, right? Ptolemies. Their general's named Ptolemy. And so they occupied that region. The other big one is going to be represented in green. Sometimes you could refer to them as the Syrians. They are the Seleucids, Seleucus, or the Seleucids. They're the other really big one. And these Syrian people, Antioch was their capital, and most of them are going to either be named one of two names. Seleucus is one of those names, or the other name I bet you've heard before, Antiochus. Seleucus or Antiochus are going to be the two prominent names that empire uses. Now we've got some others. We have this Lysimachus, is how I think it's pronounced, and they get the cities of Thrace and Bithynia. Cassander is another one. This is somebody he married one of Alexander's half-sisters, and he gave her a city. This city that he gave her was called Thermae, and her name was Thessalonice. So, and that means victory on the sea. So he gave her this city as a tribute to her, and he named that city Thessalonica. And I imagine you've heard of that place, right? There's a church there, and two of the books of the New Testament, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we're talking about that place. So that's where it got the name. And then we have this group of people called the Hasmoneans. Now I make a big mistake of confusing who these people are because I learned of them as the Maccabeans. Maccabean or Hasmonean, we're talking one and the same. These people are the same group of people, and this would be a particular tribe or house of Jewish people, the Maccabeans or the Hasmoneans. So you can even see from the map, from what we're looking at, let's see, if this comes up. Yeah, you can even see from looking at the map who are the ones that really matter in the strategy of the world, Well, it's going to be the Seleucids, and the Ptolemies. The ones who control Egypt, this orange here, and the one that controls this massive area of green. The others, as a matter of fact, they just broke them down to other Greek states because they just don't amount to as much. So they're just not nearly as significant. So my understanding is there may have been as many as 8 generals that divided up all this land. But by and large, if you can remember 2 major divisions, I think you'll be good. Yeah, there were more, there were others. But as far as the politics of that world and who controlled everything, it's going to be the Seleucids and the Ptolemies are going to be the major guys, the major players here. So that's going to affect the time of Jesus eventually. Why? Well, Jesus comes during the reign of a nation after these people, right? The Greeks. Who was it that reigned before the Greek Empire? Yeah, the Medo-Persian Empire. And before then, we get back to what empire?
Babylonian.
The Babylonian Empire. Yeah, Babylonian Empire. And you remember guys like Daniel were alive during the Babylonian Empire and even entered into the Persian Empire in its beginning times, right? And then you go before that, and yes, you'd have groups like the Assyrians and stuff. So we're going right on through history, and we're getting pretty close now. We really are making some progress. So there's a lot of, all right, so we're getting into the Ptolemies, all named Ptolemy. There's a lot of really neat history. I think it's pretty neat about the Greeks, but it's one of those information overload problems for me. There's just so many things happening, and then you combine the fact that they're named with the same names, and it really throws me for a loop. So I'll try not to jumble all this together. This guy, the first Ptolemy, was very cruel to Jews. He just did not treat them well. When he took over Jerusalem, which is one of the things that he did, he came to the city of Jerusalem to take it over, he decided that the best time to take over that city, which by the way he did, he named that city, actually not just that one, he renamed several cities Ptolemais for himself. But can you guess what day he chose to attack Jerusalem?
Sabbath.
Just take it. Why the Sabbath?
Because they couldn't fight back.
Because he heard these strict Jews have these religious things that they, observe. Their law tells them that they can't do any work on the Sabbath day. So that was the day he picked. And it really worked in his favor because a lot of strict Jews would not go walking, which is another thing that's kind of sad because they were really observing a tradition related to the Sabbath. There was no specific scripture on the Sabbath in the Old Covenant that defined how much walking they could do or things like that. And I don't remember reading any about military service either if they were attacked. But some of these guys were trying to observe the traditions, and this is a case where a man-made tradition that was supposed to be helpful was a hindrance. And so these people ended up coming in. The Ptolemy I came in, was able to take him over, and it was really, really easy. It kind of reminds me, and this is where I get into trouble because I don't know my history very well, but my understanding was, so correct me if I'm wrong, Pearl Harbor, what day did that take place?
December 2nd.
Sunday.
It was a Sunday, wasn't it?
No.
My understanding was it was on a Sunday, and one of the reasons was, and this is from a Netflix documentary I watched twice. But one of the reasons was because the Japanese knew, well, a lot of them are Christians, and a lot of them observe Sunday, so they probably won't be as heavily guarded. They probably won't be as ready for a fight. So we'll choose Sunday as a day to come in. That's my understanding of that. So it is strategic. But in the same sense, it's kind of heartless and cruel too, and it could anger people. So this guy, renamed several cities Ptolemais. He brought 100,000 Jews into Alexandria, Egypt. And he put 3,000 of these Jews into an Egyptian army on his behalf. This is where, if I could ask someone to look up a scripture, it would help me. I forgot to do that earlier. Isaiah chapter 19. Verse 18 and verse 19. Can someone, who will get Isaiah chapter 19, verse 18 and verse 19? Who will read that? You?
I got it.
All right. Yeah, when you get there, if you could read that, and we'll see if this is the correct reference or not. I should have checked it ahead of time.
You said Isaiah 18?
Isaiah chapter 19, and then start in verse 18 and read 2 verses there. If you can.
Yep. 18 and 19?
Please, yeah. What does it say?
In that day, 5 cities in Egypt will speak the language of Canaan and swear allegiance to the Lord Almighty. One of them will be called the City of the Sun. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt, and a monument to the Lord at its border.
Isn't it interesting? What, does it make any sense that Egypt should speak the language of Canaan? Does it make any sense that there should be a mix of those two? Now, I realize a lot of these prophecies, I do think, can be understood in various ways. There is a real possibility that we're talking about, if we look forward into the future kingdom, where God's kingdom over this earth, a lot of people have, Egyptians, Americans, and all alike have become Christians and are sharing, that language and things like that. But isn't it also interesting that in not too distant of the future, we have that exact situation happening where people from Canaan, Jewish people, a huge amount of them were taken back to Egypt and are actually, even 3,000 of them are serving in the Egyptian army, which it wasn't the Egyptian army, it was the Ptolemies army. But you get the idea. It fits that prophecy very well. It's as though Isaiah the prophet, speaking from God, knew what was going to happen before it happened. Kind of weird, huh? Kind of strange. So that's one of the things that happened. And this guy, we already said the Ptolemies shared the same name over and over again, right? One of the things that they picked up from the Egyptians, I believe, were initially responsible for this, but then there are several others that followed suit. These guys did what also the Herods would do. They married within their own family a lot. And when they marry within their own family, that's incest, and it's not, my understanding is it's not the healthiest way to do things either. It's just not a great idea. But can you understand what would be the logic for Egyptians in the beginning? What would be the reason why Egyptians would want to marry within their own family and not from other people?
To keep their royal bloodline good.
Why does the royal bloodline need to be separated?
Because they thought that their pharaoh was a god.
Yes, the pharaohs were worshipped as deities. They were gods. So you can't have gods mixing with just any old human. So that was an excuse for them to intermarry with themselves. And my understanding is that the genetics and everything that kind of took, the pharaohs tend to get crazier the more you go down, and kind of history bears out the fact that they probably weren't all with it. You know what I mean? It just wasn't the best thing for them, not a good idea. However, these guys picked that up. The Ptolemies picked up that thinking too and decided to really esteem themselves and treat it that way. And we remember the Herods. A lot of that Herodian family, the Herods, they did the same kind of thing. So it was something that was done. Didn't want to mix the gods with the humans, they'd say. So Ptolemy II did a number of things, as I understand it, that were, he was Ptolemy II Philadelphus. He did a number of things as far as building projects that I believe were significant. I heard one of them was a great lighthouse that he built. It was one of the wonders of the world. So there are some architectural things that he did, but the most significant thing for us that I think matters to us is that he assembled a group of Jewish people to make the LXX. Now, some of you know this. What does LXX, what does that abbreviation stand for?
70?
Yeah, LXX is Roman numeral 70. The 70 represents what? The Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? The 70, the Septuagint. What is that?
Greek translation.
It is the Greek version of what?
Old Testament.
The Old Testament. The Old Testament's written in Hebrew, not in Greek. However, people in the days of Jesus spoke what?
Greek.
They spoke Greek. Yeah, primarily they spoke Greek. So they needed a translation that would identify with their Greek language. So this guy assembled some Jews to make that translation, to bring the Old Testament into their language, and it was the Septuagint. Now, why is the Septuagint significant? Well, obviously it's significant because people, needed to understand the Old Testament. That was important. But what do we know about Jesus? Does Jesus ever say anything or imply anything about the Septuagint? Maybe I didn't ask that right, but I heard somebody say it. Yeah, Jesus chooses to quote from the Septuagint at times. So in my thinking, I'm not sure he's trying to validate it as like, oh, this is the perfect translation. Now, you could probably make a stronger case for that translation than King James version, right? Because Jesus quoted that. He never quoted King James, as far as I know. Even though the Apostle Paul had it in his hand, right? That's what we say. But but nonetheless, this was a real breakthrough. This was something that did the people of God a favor. It provided scripture in the common tongue, and Jesus is going to use that, which I like too. Maybe this is a little side note or whatever. Jesus is enough of a theologian and a scholar to be super correct in every single word that he says, and I know that. But the fact that he was okay with quoting somebody else's version, to me, it's a little bit reaffirming, because I know even in the hardest I study, I may not always get it completely right. I may try to represent a truth, but I don't know if I'm really representing it as good as God wanted it represented, right? But there seems to be at least a little bit of leeway, a little bit of grace that God allows his people to have in trying to communicate to each other. And I think it's reassuring to me that Jesus had no problem quoting from the Bible of the people, even though he could have said, well, that was technically not the best translation. I was there, I helped, whatever. He could have tweaked it, but he didn't bother with that. So it makes me feel better. Ptolemy II, responsible for that. Ptolemy III, during his reign, the empire will reach the biggest size that it has, that it ever did. So that was kind of the accomplishment of him. Ptolemy IV, I've listed all his accomplishments there. See all that? Yeah, nice. At least that's all I learned about him. So there you go, Ptolemy IV. Ptolemy V is kind of cool because he's mentioned in this thing called the Rosetta Stone, which is really weird to me because I didn't know they even had computers back then. The Rosetta Stone, he's on it. It's crazy, right? So what the guy who taught this class initially mentioned was that in the year 1798, right around 1799, one of Napoleon's men found a stone, and this stone was about 4 feet wide, about 2.5 feet tall, had 3 languages on this particular stone, and the languages were Greek, they were some hieroglyphs, and some demonics, I believe was the third one. And so, it was very, very helpful because it's a matter of like, well, we recognize this Greek, but what are these other languages? What are these things? Well, they theorized that, hey, I think this is going to be a copy. I think the same thing is written in multiple languages, kind of as an edict to get the word out there or whatever. And their theory was correct. So they ended up translating it. But you know who actually did? Have any of you heard of this? You know who did the translation? Who successfully cracked the code? It was a what? Anyone hear it? Okay. It was a 12-year-old French boy.
Whoa.
His name is Francois Champollion, something like that. Francois Champollion. Yeah. Anyway, he worked 4 years on it, so he didn't crack it until he was 16.
Whoa.
4 years of dedication.
That's awesome.
It's like a small MiDA program. He finally cracked the code, and he was able to translate. So he was obviously a real genius. And why does that matter? Well, it was a big help in affirming our understanding of the intertestamental period, that whole time. So the work of that guy. So the fact that one of the Ptolemies is mentioned there is, probably a significant thing. And let's see. Another name that's often mentioned in connection with archaeology is Sir Henry Rawlinson. He's another guy that provided some big help to this field of archaeology, which I'm saying that. What is archaeology?
Study
Study of our past.
old things.
Yeah, it's from, you've heard of the term archaic, old. It's the study of old things. You find old things. Did you have a comment?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the reasons the Rosetta Stone was so significant is all the discoveries from ancient Egypt. Before that time, they weren't sure how to interpret any of those hieroglyphics. So it wasn't until then that they could go back. They only had stabs in the dark before that.
Ah, okay. So that was a significant, wow. So the work of a 12-year-old kid unlocked a lot of history for us. That's interesting. Yeah, interesting. Oh, cool. Thanks for mentioning that. So, wow. Yeah. Now, so that helped us in our understanding. The final person of Egypt that we have mentioned there, did I put it on there? Cleopatra, the last of the Ptolemies. That's one exception there. The Jews suffered greatly during the wars between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and that's what Josephus tells us. But it makes sense. Why does it make sense that the Jews would suffer a lot during the wars between these two major nations? Well, let's take a look. Where do the Jews reside? Where do they live? Right smack dab on the front line there. So you can imagine what an awful time that would be for Jewish people. Whoops, where did I go? Okay, yeah. So they suffered quite a bit. And then 198 BC at the Battle of Banias, the Ptolemies finally lose to the Seleucids, and they lose for good. And the Seleucids, the Syrians, kind of gain the power. Now, when they gain the power, There's still a lot more that happens, and this is where even more so. The last bit of this study I really think is just very informational, and it's very good, but there's just so much that takes place. Part of me hates it because I feel as though if you were living there and you were experiencing it, this would be huge to you. It's massive. But you know how we live where we live, and then you hear, oh, I didn't realize it, but a few months ago there was a mass killing somewhere in Africa. A whole village got slaughtered or something, Why didn't that affect us? Well, because we didn't live in Africa, But it's sad to me that sometimes if there happened to be an American there, whoa, then we'll hear all about it, because an American was killed over it. You know what I mean? It's sad to me that such significant things kind of get watered down a lot of times, but it's because so much is going on all over the world. And so this is a case of where the same thing is taking place. A lot of stuff takes place in the intertestamental period, but a lot of it's going to get lost because more significant things in the world scheme are taking place. And so, when you're looking at the top level, you forget to pay attention to what's happening deep down below the surface with the pawns and the chess game, things like that. So the Seleucids, the Seleucids are primarily, and by the way, you hear me making that mistake, Seleucids, I always mix it up. Do you know which one is correct? The Syrians, Seleucids or
I
Seleucids?
always heard Seleucids.
Seleucids? All right, I'm going to try to stick with one. Bank on something. Antiochus would be one of the people that ruled there. Antiochus III came, not much significant I have in my notes about him, but then Antiochus IV took the name Epiphanes. Epiphanes, which literally means God manifest, or it's another way of saying God, I am God. How do you think the Jews felt about that?
Angry.
I don't think they like that too much. I feel like that wouldn't, hear the Lord our God, the Lord is one, love him with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And yet this guy who takes over their area gives himself the name that says, God is here, I am God. So there are a couple of factions at this time of Jewish high priests. So Ananias and Tobias. Tobias was a Syrian, and this guy Antiochus replaced one of them with a guy named Jason, who was a Hellenizer. What is Hellenization again?
Greek influence.
Greek influence, yes. So this would have been someone that was sympathetic with what Antiochus stood for, and not what Jewish law stood for, or the Jewish Old Testament stood for. So he was using his power, Mr. I am God, using his power to interfere with Jewish worship to just reaffirm himself, and causing all kinds of problems when that happened. The Jews, however, they didn't want anything to do with this type of Hellenization. They weren't looking for that. So Jason, this new priest that was put in, did all these things in order to force Jerusalem to become more Greek-like, to be more sympathetic to Greek ideals. So what all did he do? Well, he forced them to worship the Greek gods. He even took an image of Jupiter and put it in their temple. He did not allow sacrifices, the sacrificial system of the law, to be practiced anymore. He said that was forbidden. He got rid of circumcision, said that was banned, you can't do that. Got rid of all feast days, including the Sabbath. He outlawed those. He took scriptures and he would either burn them or mutilate them publicly. That was one of the things that he chose to do. He forced certain Jews to eat pork and to offer sacrifices to Zeus or Jupiter. And Greek soldiers would perform heathen sex rites in the temple courts. Along with that, this Bacchus, this god of partying or wine, they made people participate in that form of worship. They built a track which, this guy pointed out that things like this I wouldn't think of. When they're conducting a big building project, it was typical practice for them to not even be clothed when they did that. So that was another thing. They would work in the nude. They would force pagan prayers and some of the Jews were influenced by all these things, and they would even change their names to reflect that. So some of their names would turn to these Greek names instead of their Jewish names, because they were slowly caving way to the pressure. However, there were those separatist Jews, those Jews that said, we have nothing to do with this, and we are separating ourselves from it, and they were called Pharisees, the strict ones of the bunch. So, I mean, you can take a look at that. All these things that were made to happen, right, to the Jewish people. And who caused them? The priest. The priest. I mean, people talk about the persecution of Christians today and religious persecution and stuff like that. But I got to tell you, by comparison, there almost is no comparison. We are nowhere near the type of persecution that Christians have had to endure, people of God have had to endure throughout the age. And this is a good reminder to me too, that just because he's a priest does not mean that he should be listened to, and does not mean that he has the right to be in that position, and so on and so forth. And just because this guy's a preacher of a huge congregation, or just because that guy wrote several books, or just because this guy has a commentary on Scripture this tall, does not mean you should take anything they say seriously. It does not mean that at all. And the thing I want to end with, and then I'll ask you guys if you have any questions or comments, is my professor sternly warned me about a guy named S.R. Driver. S.R. Driver is a scholar who wrote the dictionary, the Hebrew dictionary. He was one of the significant contributors of that and massive commentaries. And Doc Smith told us that guy who did all that, all that famous Hebrew work, was one of the, in his opinion, did a lot more damage to the faith than so many other people have done. And his reason for saying that was, this guy was a very good person. And initially I'm thinking, what? A good person? How does that do damage? Well, I'll tell you how that does damage. Someone who is really smart intellectually and can lay out dictionaries that help us understand the Bible and can live a very moral life while at the same time not really committing to what Jesus says and submitting to him, that's the kind of person that will lead lots of other people astray, because they're respectable, they're distinguished, they're someone that, I can feel safe following in this guy's shoes because he's clearly a morally great person who lived. My professor's comment was he lived a very pious life, very good lifestyle, and that does so much damage to the faith, people who live a good life. And you guys know this, how many people are are not coming to the church because they say, I'm working on it, but I'm not good enough yet. They've bought into this misconception that you somehow have to be good enough before you attain some sort of forgiveness, which is absolutely the opposite of the situation. We want you here because you're never going to be good enough. But you get guys like that, and it just buys into this bad ideology that is not true scripturally. So it's just a reminder that it's the people within our own faith, within our churches, that I think we don't want to be hateful or unloving, but we got to really watch out, because they can do the real damage. And history proves that. You get them to infiltrate, and then you divide and conquer. So you guys have any thoughts about this? Have you seen this kind of thing take place in your life? I'm sure you have, but anyone got any comments, questions, suggestions? Anyone planning to split the church? Okay, just checking. All right, hey, well, let's pray. Father, I pray that we're up for persecution wherever it comes. And God, I reminded that to be separate is another way of saying to be holy. And God, that's what we want to be, because we know that's who you are. So help us in our effort to live holy lives while we're still in a fallen world. Help us to stay connected to you. Help us to remember that even though history gets hard and tough and people despair, you're never out of the picture. You're never in a place where you've forgotten anything. You're always at work. Remind us of that when we hit dark spots in life too. Please help us to remember to keep relying on you, to not forget about the fact that you're at work. Help us not to buy into the lies that we hear, especially the ones that are the most believable, because they get a lot of people, and the ones that come from seemingly good sources. God, just keep us connected to your word so that we can see right through it and follow that light that you put right in front of our path. Thank you for everyone here, for the encouragement they are to me. Thank you for the patience that they have. And Father, I'm just so grateful for what they know and what you've allowed them to experience in life, and for the impact that they are having, I know, in the lives of others. I'm so grateful. Thank you for letting us all be a part of this great, great mission that's so much better than any national or any nation or power here on earth. And I pray these things in Jesus' name.
Amen.
Thank you.
So, thank you for all your hard work.
Yeah, thanks, Seth.
Thanks.